So, hi everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Biome podcast. So, recently, Robi and I finally managed to talk to Derek Gow after a couple of failed attempts. So, Derek Gow is a farmer, nature conservationist, ecologist, reintroduction specialist, founder of the Derek Gow Consultancy and the Coombs Head Rewilding Project, and is also author of Bringing Back the Beaver, which is a fantastic book that was published last September. So we're really, really excited to be able to share this interview with you. We really hope you enjoy it. So yeah, thanks so much for joining us again. Really appreciate it. So do you just maybe want to start by telling us a bit about yourself and kind of the work that you're doing at the moment?
My name is Derek Gow. I am a freelance wildlife ecologist. I work on a range of different species and do a range of different things. I've just been standing out in the rain at the moment, building some film sets to go to Svalbard tomorrow for a BBC film on Arctic wildlife.
Oh, cool.
Wow.
Fantastic. So just to kind of do a little background of yourself, because obviously we've been talking about rewilding and British ecology for quite a while now, so we know all about you. But for our viewers who maybe don't know so much about you, would you like to give us maybe an overview of the kind of projects you run and how it all started for you, how Coombs Head Rewilding started?
Okay, the projects we run. Okay, so on the farm, so I own 300 acres up at a place called Broadwood Widger, off to one side of Rodford Reservoir in Devon. We have large captive breeding programs for harvest mice, water voles, white storks, wildcats, and we have also some large holding pens with European beavers in them. How did it all start for me? Well, as a small kid, I read Gerald Durrell's books. I was terribly impressed by the man and this idea that he was going to go wading off into the forests of whatever wild region of the world there was to catch creatures and bring them back to a zoo in Jersey to try to captive breed them to provide animals for release at a time when the world was better. And therefore, like very many people, I was quite deeply moved by that. And I decided that's what I was going to do in life. Now, life, as you'll probably be aware, is seldom that straightforward. So I worked in agriculture for a while. I farmed. I bought and sold livestock, and then eventually, through connections with the Rare Breed Survival Trust, an organisation that was set up to conserve types of sheep and cattle and pigs that in the 1970s were becoming increasingly scarce as the homogenization of agriculture really took hold. I was offered the position of a part-time environmental educator in a country park in central Scotland. And then when that job finished, I went on to run what at that time was quite a small zoo there. We specialised in British and European wildlife species, which was quite an unusual thing to do at that time. So we kept and bred things like chamois and European bison and all sorts of different things. And really that's where I began. I mean, I've worked in zoos for 16 years. I came down to develop a new centre for sea life centres in the New Forest, which was going to be this kind of like nature quest type experience where you go underground and smell badgers farting in the tunnels and all sorts of different things. And that was good fun, but that finished, and then set up another project over in the east of England. And when that finished, I decided I really wasn't going to work with anybody else anymore. I was going to work with myself. So I bought the farms eventually. I've spent 16 years building and shaping them in the way I want them to be. Approximately half of the land now is being rewilded, and what we've done is put a big perimeter fence right the way around it. There are a few Iron Age pigs, Exmoor ponies, water buffalo, some het cattle, and some mouflon, in that area, creating living space for a whole host of other species. And right next door to the area where the big animals are, we also have a captive breeding facility for wildcats.
So I guess it sounds incredible. And we've also been inspired by Isabella Tree and her partner in Knepp Estate, kind of similar idea there with that bringing in those species which were lost and kind of having that function restored. And so you've been called the Beaver Man in the past, which is an epic title to have. But sort of, are we correct in saying that your work with that side of wildlife conservation started with water voles? Was it the water voles that kind of started that process?
It was certainly water voles that started the thought process, because water voles are relatively, I mean, even though they're the largest British vole species, they're a small animal, a very, very small animal. And in the mid-1990s, there was huge concern about the status, about the rapid decline the species had undergone. It was quite an iconic British species. You know, there were ladybird brooks written for kids in the 50s called the sleepy water vole. It featured in Kenneth Grahame's book, The Wind in the Willows, as his famous character of Ratty in his fore and aft hat, sculling up and down the Windrush with his friend the mole on a boat. And so it really was a little animal that was quite fondly thought of. And yet, like very many little animals that are quite fondly thought of, for example, you know, another example might be red squirrels. It was slipping away in a landscape that was becoming increasingly hostile to any kind of life that was not connected with our interests. And a lot of money was spent and a lot of effort went into trying to save the water vole at that time and trying to understand or to get a better grip on its, an understanding of its ecology and nature conservation requirements. And when I became involved in this because by that time we had quite a large captive breeding program for very many British wild animal species, and water voles were one of them. And as you started to look at the sort of things you were being encouraged to do to create water vole habitat, digging ponds, cutting trees down, keeping them open and sunny, not grazing them with cattle, not stripping the vegetation edge out with sheep, you began to realize that there must have been some function in nature that made these habitats for not only those little creatures, but a whole host of other little wetland animals that require sunny, open, wet, complex wetlands. So frogs, eels, crayfish, otters, all sorts of different things like open, sunny wetlands. And of course, I knew very little about beavers at that time. I knew what a beaver was. I don't think we had ever kept them in our zoo. But I didn't understand there were two species, and I didn't really understand what they did. And in the mid-1990s, I had the opportunity to go to a place called Popielno in the Masurian Lake region of Poland. And it was there there was a state farm that had been built to breed beavers there for the fur trade in the time of Stalin. And the farm was still there. So I went to look at the farm and I went to look at the beavers, and there were some ridiculously tame beavers there, which were really quite enchanting. And then they took me out to look at beaver wetlands, and the beaver wetlands were just astounding environments. So these huge sunny wetlands right in the middle of a forest, orchids floating in on islands of decomposing vegetation, wolves hunting through them, moose feeding in them, very many mosquitoes, which as soon as you opened your mouth or breathed in went straight up your nose. And it became abundantly obvious to me that the beaver was the architect of living space for the little things, and that's really where my interest in beavers arose.
And that's really interesting that it was the link between water voles and beavers that kind of started this process. So we've been really kind of keen on beavers and filming them for quite a while. So last weekend, just gone, we went down to film beavers in the River Otter in Devon, and it was astonishing just seeing the change in landscape that they can actually create, and seeing all these kind of flooded meadows and the ponds and the water rising. It was incredible.
Yeah, and I don't know if you caught the news at lunchtime, but in the Queen's speech, there's again mention of the Environment Bill, which they're guaranteeing is now going to pass, and which has a specific reference in it to setting up a kind of task force to look at the much wider restoration of lost species. And they talked this afternoon not just about beavers, but also about lynx, wildcats, Dalmatian pelicans, and other species that used to be here. And of course, all these creatures are not here because they just gently faded from the scene. They're not here because in the end, we wanted everything. We wanted all the land. We wanted all the living space. We wanted every single one of them there was, because their fur was valuable, or their glands were valuable, or there was always a reason for us taking everything. And this us taking everything has produced the world we now have, where 95% of the living vertebrate biomass of it is us and our domestic animals, and all other life on this planet is fading fast. So, we really do need to think long and hard on this idle, conceited little island about what we're actually going to do, as opposed to talking about what kind of examples we're going to start to create. And restoring the beaver would do an immense amount of good, and create, give nature the opportunity to really start healing itself.
And I think this is something Robi and I have talked about before, but like you're saying, it's us who've driven these species to extinction. It's anthropogenic activity, so almost we see there's kind of a moral obligation there of, it was us in the first place that were the problem, so kind of it should be us to get us out of the habitats we've created now. But so talking about beaver reintroduction, there has been a lot of opposition to their reintroduction, especially from particular members in power and DEFRA and things like that. So what do you think is the biggest concern that people have with bringing them back? And sort of, do you think their concerns are justified, or is it just a lack of understanding of beavers?
There are various concerns. I mean, if you look at, the angling community, they will tell you they're concerned about migratory game fish. If you look at the farming community, they will tell you they're concerned about losing low-lying valley bottom land, which is some of the most fertile, growing meat, which provides some of the most fertile growing soils there are in Britain. If you look at DEFRA or Natural England, I mean, their concern is that they're going to do something which is irreversible, which is going to cause a whole lot of pain in future. If you look at government, well, there are people who are both for and against it. What you have a real jumbled rag bag of emotions. So it's by no manner of means straightforward for most individuals, because we did this great wrong in the past, our response to it should be to right it and to restore creatures like this. For very many people, they'd prefer to have landscapes where these creatures are not restored, and where the status quo as is maintained, even though that status quo, with the cooing and crowing over species like water voles or nightingales or turtle doves, is slipping irrevocably from our grasp. So there's a real mixed bag of emotions, and reasons why people don't want to see beavers reintroduced. But I think it's fair to say that none of them are good. At the end of it all, they're not based on anything that's sentient. They're not based on science or understanding. They're not based on wishing to repair a wounded planet and to leave it, genuinely in better heart. They're based on, as I say, a very ragged bunch of emotions and reasons, which don't amount to much in the end when you examine any one of them.
That's really interesting that you feel that way, because I think I kind of agree with you, and we do talk about this quite a lot on the podcast. Do you think the tide has potentially turned with beavers? Because 2021 is being heralded quite extensively as a kind of landmark year for beavers. So we've had the first ones come in Wales, in the Duffy Valley, and there's many more releases kind of dotted around Scotland and Wales in the pipeline. So regardless of this kind of opposition, have we reached a tipping point, or do we still have to kind of climb up the hill, do you think?
We've reached a tipping point in as much as there are sufficient wild living beavers now in both England, Scotland, and to a much lesser extent Wales, to ensure that if we do nothing in time, the species will significantly extend its range. There's a lot of faff and flannel in what's happening. And I mean, I apply for many licenses for people to keep beavers in enclosures, and for the life of me, I cannot see why we're doing this. I mean, it's an expensive business. It's becoming increasingly intricate to make people who are, actually just fools happy. And I think we are in a very dangerous place, because, you see in Scotland that when it comes to Trees for Life's legal challenge with regard to SNH's assumption that it was correct to kill the beavers on the Tay as the only response to the population management. You see, there's Nature Scot now actually taking money and allying itself with Scottish Land and Estates and the Scottish National Farmers Union. You're seeing some diabolical partnerships emerging, and the people and the organizations who should be on the side of nature are in large part, for some, behaving terribly badly. So I think that we are in a difficult, dark, and dangerous time, and to assume that it's all over and we've won would indeed be a foolish thing to do.
Because also, so linking on from that, I think you've made it quite clear kind of in your book, Bringing Back the Beaver, and in other interviews, that there is enough scientific evidence to show that beavers have a positive impact on the environment, that any more of these 5-year feasibility studies are kind of a waste of time. Why do you think these 5-year studies are still taking place and they have to be in enclosures if there is enough evidence that they could just do well in the landscape?
Why did it? Well, basically, what Natural England decided was that in its licensing division that you had to have a license to keep a Eurasian beaver in an enclosure for reasons which are still not clear. The species has been put on a thing called Schedule 9. But if I wanted to keep 6 Canadian beavers in a pen right next to them, I'd need no license, no fence checks, no nothing, and they'd do exactly the same thing. Why? It's because you've got a mindset of people in some of these organizations who can contribute nothing to nature conservation, but who are determined, nevertheless, that they wish to maintain control of its process. And it's just, is there a good reason for it? No, there is not a good reason for it. At the end of it all, it's costing a fortune to contain beavers in enclosures here, there, and everywhere. But if we don't do this and we don't get this stupid license, then those animals are executed on the bank of the Tay. Pregnant females, males, little babies, tiny kits, all killed by people who are determined they shall not be in this landscape. And therefore, it's an abominable situation. You have stupid civil servants on one hand making up silly rules for no reason that's sentient. And as you say, we don't need to study anything more about beavers in Britain. It always was the case that the information was it's not just there, it's been there for the best part of 50 years. We're just making up a ridiculous charade. And the sad thing about the charade is that the beavers themselves are caught right in the middle of it with all this nonsense, affecting their very prospect of survival. It's not a good place to be. And when you look at how much information there is about beaver reintroduction, both in Europe and North America, it should just be the case that we go out, we lift a blueprint out that's of the best. And indeed, in 2016, myself and a group of colleagues translated much of the finest work that had been done on the species into a thing called the Eurasian Beaver Conservation Management Manual. And to be quite honest, you look at some of these things sometimes, you wonder why you ever went to the bother of writing them, because I'm quite sure that the people who are trying to form a strategy now have never read the bloody thing. So at the end of it all, it's another uniquely British bodge along the lines of Yes Minister, whereby you have a whole lot of kind of like people running around like some sort of like early 20s black and white cartoons with planks over their shoulders, slapping each other in the face. Only we could create confusion of this sort.
And it's what I really thought was interesting. What you just said there is not only it's a uniquely British situation, but you said something about maintaining control of the situation. And this idea has kind of come up. We recently read Feral by George Monbiot, and he kind of links that to the kind of style of land ownership that we have in Britain, which is quite unique across Europe. Do you also see that link, or do you think there's perhaps another reason why we're so far behind the rest of Europe when it comes to reintroduction?
Well, we're a landlocked island, so wolves can never walk back here. But when you start to look at the history of an animal like this, or the modern interaction with an animal like this, it's always the old demons of sheep and agriculture from the past that come lurking out of the past to poison even the most promising of beginnings. And I don't know really what we do really about animals like that. In the end, there is something in us that just wants to hate. And when it wants to hate enough, then it starts to destroy, and it destroys in ways that are still wicked in their medievalism, and go down into the roots of our own cultural darkness in a way that is for most normal people, I think, unfathomable. When it comes to why people want to control things like this, well, I don't know. I mean, I have no idea why. I mean, maybe it keeps them in jobs. It gives them a purpose in life. If they're not playing Ludo on a Friday night with their granny and dipping rich tea biscuits in a cup of Earl Grey, otherwise it gives them, some sort of space and time to breathe and feel they have a purpose. But it's achieving bollocks all. Yeah, I mean, I can't
Fair
think
enough.
of a reason beyond that. I mean, there'll be people that tell you it's the IUCN guidelines. There'll be people that tell you it's health. There'll be people that tell you it's a whole manner of different things. But in the end, it doesn't amount to a hill of beans when you look at it in detail.
Because I think that was one paradox that we found recently. So this last weekend when we were on the River Otter, there was so much positive public engagement from people stopping to speak to us who were so happy that they were back. And it's this contradiction, I feel, because I think there was a survey and it showed that 86% of people did want the beavers back. So it kind of, to me, that highlights it's less of a problem of the public getting on board. It's more these government officials who are the ones making the decisions with the power to stop it. Because we expected more opposition when we went to look for them.
There was a certain kind of hypocrisy, which I think we've thought about before, but again, speaking to people down on the Otter, talking about beavers, the hypocrisy kind of came up again in that we spend so much time and energy criticising people overseas for their conservation of their own charismatic wildlife, and we seem to completely ignore the fact that we're doing very little for our own wildlife. There's definitely a dichotomy there, I think.
Of course there is. I mean, it's huge hypocrisy. And I mean, it's quite interesting to reflect that when you look at the news that the license has been given to reintroduce the white-tailed eagle to East Anglia following the successful releases that there have been on the Isle of Wight, that Sandringham and Prince William, really for the first time ever on a species issue of contention, said they are welcome. Because before that, the royal family have been pretty good, wandering the world, beating a drum, making a huge fuss about elephants and rhinos and whatever else, and tigers. And when it comes to Britain and birds of prey and predatory mammals, they've been pretty silent with very little to actually say. So, but it's changing, and it's changing because people the world over from other countries now are pointing out to us that at the end of it all, when we stand like a bunch of bumptious farts on the stage and say, you've got to do this and you've got to do that, well, you killed all the animals that were inconvenient as far as you were concerned.
Exactly.
Wolves, 250 years ago, beavers maybe about the same, bears a millennia ago. You killed everything. You destroyed all the forests, and you now expect us to listen to you. It's
fair enough. Their concerns are fair enough, I think.
It's completely fair enough. And in the end, I mean, how would we feel if a team of Kenyans, just kind of like floated themselves, down from a series of para ropes, landed here and said, tell you what, boys, we'll help you sort out your wildcats, because you're making a really job of it.
At this point, I'd welcome them.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's always been the case that if we really want to get nature conservation going well in Britain, the best thing we can do is employ a team of Dutchmen and some of the guys from US Fish and Game. And if we gave them free rein, they'd start to help us to really sort it out. But I think that's very highly unlikely to happen. We'll still be stuck with the Sir Humphreys for some time to come.
Hi everyone, it's Kate here, and I'm really excited to tell you that this episode of the Biome podcast is sponsored by Animal Tea. Animal Tea is a UK specialty tea company that donates 100% of its profits to fund wildlife conservation. Their range of 8 loose leaf teas include everyday favourites like their organic white tea to rare treasures like the Satin Noir spearmint. I'm drinking the Earl Grey and it's my new favourite tea to have every morning. Listeners to the podcast can get 15% off their first order by going to animaltea.com, spelt ANIMALLTEA.com, and using the code BIOME at checkout. Orders arrive in a compostable pouch plus a piece of original wildlife art with every order. Every tea they sell helps fund global conservation projects, from primates to pangolins, leopards to lions. So if you want 15% off your first order, check out animaltea.com, ANIMALLTEA.com, and use the code BIOME, BIOME, all in capitals, at checkout. And now, back to the podcast.
So, moving on now to the subject of these native carnivores that we've obviously completely wiped out in Britain, and we're now only slowly even beginning to come to terms with thinking about bringing them back. It seems like the lynx probably stands more of a chance than the wolf at present. And there's a lot of discussion going on with people saying, lynx should only be here, they should only be here. There was one study which we actually interviewed the guy who ran it, and he kind of came to the conclusion that only isolated bits of Scotland like Kintyre and Aberdeenshire are suitable for lynx. How do you feel about that? Do you think we should only kind of tuck them away in these kind of isolated patches, or do you think there's a possibility that we could live alongside them if we really tried?
I don't think you'll tuck anything like that away in isolated patches. I think in the end, wherever you put it, it will come out. And I mean, I've been coming and going, running field trips to Bavaria for, I don't know, probably somewhere in the region of 20 years now. And when we were there initially, though we were not there to look at lynx, the lynx was something that was up in the Bavarian forest. It was not an animal of the farmlands in the valley below. And then the last time we were there last year, one of the guys from the Farmers Union was saying, well, this field we're standing in, when they cut the maize in the autumn, they flushed out 3 lynx. And of course, what the lynx are doing is they're just adapting to the environments we create, and they're coming down, following the deer and following the wild boar into the corn crops and hunting them there. So I think if you say, well, this is lynx habitat in Scandinavia, lynx habitat anywhere else, and in Britain, lynx are going to behave in this way, then you forget the lesson of the wild boar. And the lesson of the wild boar was that 20 years ago, Scottish Natural Heritage commissioned a feasibility study to look at whether it would be possible to reintroduce wild boar to Britain. And it told them that there wouldn't be, because it wouldn't be possible because there wasn't enough deciduous woodland, or there wasn't enough nutmast to maintain a population that's viable. But what, of course, it did was it ignored all the potatoes and gardens and carrots and sugar beet crops and maize crops and everything else. And when wild boar eventually did escape and stabilise, they were perfectly capable of living in the landscapes that are cultural to us. They're versatile creatures. They'll use what opportunities there are, and good luck to them. So I think lynx will do the same. I think you could reintroduce the lynx. You could certainly reintroduce the wildcat, and that's a species we're looking quite actively at the restoration of at the moment. And why would you not do it? I mean, again, you're going to get people whining about sheep, and they're probably going to kill sheep. And that's almost certainly inevitable. We have a huge sheep flock in this country, which is virtually entirely supported by state subsidies for reasons that are utterly unclear. And therefore, while you have sheep in those numbers and they live in things called fields surrounded by fences and are not protected at night, then they can only do so where you have no large predators. So something like the lynx would I'm sure it would utilise the roe deer resource there is. It would also utilise the other smaller deer species we have, which are introduced in common here, like muntjac, Chinese water deer, Japsika, fallow, that sort of thing as well. But it's also going to have an impact on sheep. And in the past, every single time something walks out of a wood and kills a sheep, you think the earth was folding. But does it really need to be that way?
I mean, I suppose if there's enough subsidies to keep sheep farming at the scale as it is, without the profit, there's presumably enough money to compensate for sheep losses on the rare occasions that they might occur.
Well, that's not the way the guys farming would feel. And to be quite honest, I think the issue is not subsidy, or not the compensations for losses. It's why on earth we as taxpayers are paying to keep all these sheep anyway. I mean, I'm taking it that you as an individual get no subsidy for anything, do you? Are you a student? You get?
Yeah, we're students.
Right. Okay. Do you get what are your grants like? How much do you get in grants a year?
About
4.5, isn't it?
£4,000.
Something like that, yeah.
You get £4,000. Okay, so
Yeah.
between the two, you get £8,000. Well, I get somewhere in the region of about £24,000 of your money for doing bugger all. That's my mid-tier, in theory, nature conservation commitment to my land, to renew fences, cut trees back, achieve nothing, absolutely nothing at all from a nature conservation point of view. It just makes it easy for people with a map to figure out how much money to give me. And then I got a thing called single farm payment, which is based on historic payments that my farm was getting in 2005, and I get that for doing nothing. So all you people out there listening to this who are not farmers, do understand it. It's very nice, and thank you very much for it. All the money you're giving me, I'm getting for doing pretty much nothing, and certainly nothing that's anything to do with nature conservation. So I really think it's high time that these subsidies that were paid to farmers were taken and turned round to create a landscape where you have to farm sustainably, you have to put dung back into the soil, and you have to farm in a way that retains your soil in good heart. You have to farm in a way that's sympathetic with regard to wildlife, and that's going to mean pulling in the prairie fields, creating very many more small woodland and edge habitats. But you also have to farm in a way that's sympathetic to wild animals anyway, and that is going to be the biggest challenge of all, because ever since we stood on our hind legs and our tails dropped off in whatever savanna habitat we were occupying at that time, we view other animals in a way that's almost ubiquitously ruthless. I mean, on my way up to, back here to work this afternoon, there's a poster in the shop, the garage where I stopped to pick up my poultry corn, and it's a hound racing event, sometime in June, whereby people have come and have a bet about how fast a hound can jump over fences, and they time them and whatever other bollocks they get involved with. And the long and the short of it is it's a hunting culture. It's a hunting culture that here in the people surrounding where I live is still very strong and unifies a community in a way that pretty much nothing else does. But that hunting culture in its darkest of mindsets has changed not at all, since the Middle Ages, when we were, catching wolves and wiring their mouths shut and burning them to death with pitch and pits. So when it comes to it, the people that make the decisions about what's going to live in this landscape are really not you. I'm sorry, that's not the way it works. You may feel that you're part of a society where things like 86% of people saying we want beef, makes a difference or not, but it's not the way. The people who make a difference to what survives in this landscape or not are the people who are off to watch the hounds jump in fences in 3 weeks' time. And that's a fairly sobering thought.
Yeah.
There are exceptions, of course, and things are changing, but there are an awful lot of people who are determined that there should be no change at all, and you're subsidising them. Why?
Yeah.
Blimey.
No, I think that is very sobering, because as with a lot of issues, like we say, linking to the badger cull, for example, people don't realise that is taxpayers' money. That is not only funding, say, like you were mentioning with farmers, to not do anything sustainably on their land, but it's also directly funding harmful practices to wildlife. And maybe that's the change that needs to happen, that people being aware of where their money is actually being spent. But like you say, it's the people at the top who are kind of in charge of all those decisions.
Well, it isn't. I mean, at the end of the day, things like the badger cull is an interesting case in point. The badger's it's very complicated. It's got a lot to do with other factors which have nothing much to do with badgers at all. We've created landscapes that are good for badgers because they're open. We've killed the predators, they're full of worms, and the badgers have moved out to use those habitats and to feed in them and to grow in numbers, exponentially as a result. But it's got a lot to do with the way we keep cattle. It's got a lot to do with the testing regimes, a lot to do with biosecurity. It's almost certainly got a lot to do with deer. And at the end of it all, we just don't want to hear those things. What we want to do is kill badgers. I mean, it's back to medievalism. It's back to people jumping up and down and shouting loud enough, and then building pyres in the villages, catching your witch, sticking her on top and setting fire to her. It's not changed that much. The only thing that's changed is the suits of the politicians who in the end are forced into a position whereby they say, burn the witch. It's quite scary when you start to understand it in that way.
So quite a big opposing argument to all this kind of habitat restoration, ecosystem functionality stuff that we're kind of talking about. Quite a big opposition argument, which I hear quite a lot. In fact, I've had some of these conversations with my family who are kind of on board but unclear, and their kind of concern is, well, how far back do you go? How far, do you want to restore Britain to a Pleistocene interglacial period, or are we actually trying to move forward and create a framework for all of us together? And I feel that this movement actually branches off in quite a few different directions when it comes to this. So in particular with your work, I'm quite interested in, where do you see yourself going? Are you trying to go backwards to a primordial Britain, or kind of forwards to a new idea?
What we're looking at is making a landscape that's rich in wildlife, good for people, good for farming, good for other land use industries. It's as simple as that. There is no going back. In going forward, there could very well be a case for restoring very many lost species, and not just the ones that we did to death in the last couple of centuries, like pine martens and wildcats and beavers. But also potentially, if you look at a lot of the highland, like the lakes, where we have so ruined the environments through overgrazing and deforestation, that there's virtually nothing left of substance alive up there. I mean, just to give you an example, a few years ago, I stayed at the RSPB's centre at Haweswater overnight, and because they're terrible hosts and they don't have any beer, you have to sit and read a lot of their boring journals in the dark bedroom lit by a single flickering light bulb. And when you sit down and you read the journals about the last of the golden eagles in the Lake District, those birds virtually starved to death. They had very low chick numbers. Eventually, they futtered out about 10 years ago. And I spoke to one of the Forestry Commission guys who was in charge up there at the time. And Norman Healy said that, they fed that old eagle. If they hadn't been shooting deer and feeding the eagle, there wasn't enough food in the whole of the Lake District to feed a couple of pairs of breeding eagles.
Wow.
And that's because, the farming's changed, the sheep have come off the high fells, but the sheep have taken everything. The rabbits have viral hemorrhagic, the hares have gone. So when you look up, yes, there will be field voles there, and yes, there will be a few red grouse, and yes, there will be a few dead sheep, and yes, there will be a few crows, but there's very little food. And time again, when you look at these environments, and we fail to understand that we have so taken everything that the big things now are struggling to find enough to keep themselves going. So we need to start restoring food, and that's feeding our birds in the garden. It's maybe leaving carrion tables up on farms for things like the white-tailed eagles, so that when they do come inland away from the coast, there are dead deer lying on tables quite legally on farms that have been picked up off the road, and they're decomposing there, and the eagles can feed on them. But it might also mean that in places that are so trashed, like like the Lake District landscape or the peak or the peaks, then maybe in the end, as we move to a better world and things like driven grouse shooting decline, it might not be a bad idea to start reintroducing some of the Ice Age animals, the pikas and the marmots and the hamsters and the reindeer, because in the end, if we more or less created an Ice Age landscape, if these Ice Age animals survive there, then these big rodents will provide a lot of food. And in the end, if the landscape forests up again after all our abominations are done, then these animals won't survive anyway. So in going forward, having a look at what was here in the past might also be an avenue that's worth exploring. But the whole purpose is to look forward, not back, and just to look at to explore how we create a landscape that is much, much richer in wildlife, for all of our good in the end.
And so does your water buffalo herd come into that? So we had a functional analogue in the interglacial periods. I remember reading about someone found a water buffalo skull in the Thames once, which I thought was really cool. So is that kind of you looking forward and bringing some of these big animals back in?
Well, I'm not sure about the water buffalo in the Thames. You might be right. You might very well be right. But as far as I'm aware, the European water buffalo, came as far up as the Channel coast. And I think there's been some work done on the DNA of water buffalo in Germany, which suggests that in the captive buffalo of Western Eastern Europe, there may still be this is extinct wild European water buffalo gene base as opposed to the water buffalo. Anyway, the long and the short of it is that buffalo, as far as I'm aware, never made Britain. They certainly made the Channel coast, but they did not make Britain.
Okay.
The buffalo you've got to view them as natural contractors. So they are the guys that are going out into that area, and when it starts to get warm and summer and they're uncomfortable, they are going to go down like gigantic burrowing moles into the drains and the seepages with their horns and their hooves, and they are going to build ponds. Because we always view ponds and water as being something that's in the bottom of a valley, at a distance, in a line, running through it as a single entity. Water was once everywhere. And we filled in the ponds, we filled in the complications, we've sunk the tiny streams, that were once the capillaries that filled the veins, that filled the arteries, that led the water through the land, to the point now where we just can't see, we can't even begin to imagine what these landscapes once looked like. And the buffalo in our place are going to just start punching holes in the Earth's crust and bringing water to the surface to provide life space for amphibians, frogs, dragonflies, whatever else. They too are part of going forward. They're tools that are going to do a good job.
No, I think that's absolutely fantastic, and we're definitely looking forward to kind of seeing how that progresses, especially with the wildlife that you have on your land. So I guess just to bring this interview to a close, we thought we'd end with one last question about beavers. So what would you like to see moving forwards when it comes to beavers in the UK?
I would like to see basically us adopting a Bavarian beaver management plan, which is sensible, pragmatic, which easily gives landowners, groups of landowners in catchments, the ability to assemble groups of beavers, be they imported or be they captive bred or be they removed from the Tay, and to release them back into our river systems quickly. If we're going to, we talk all the time about global warming, extinction crisis. You watch Greta on Sunday TV weeping into her herbal tea about the danger we're in. And she's right. That little girl who's come at this time has spoken so much sense. If we are serious about acting quickly, we have to deregulate the restoration of the beaver and ignore those people who talk nonsense and say it can't be done and it shouldn't be done. It absolutely is time to restore this creature. As I said earlier on, you restore the beaver. The beaver is not a keystone species. The beaver is a function of nature, and we give nature the opportunity to start to repair herself. We must do this swiftly, and we must do this with quite clearly and quite utterly without unnecessarily red tape and regulation.
Well, thank you so much. That's fantastic. It's been a real privilege for us to speak to you on our end. We've really enjoyed it as well. We kind of talk about rewilding and reintroduction all the time, so it's great to speak to someone who's kind of actively involved with it. And I'm really interested in the water buffalo. I think it's a fantastic idea.
Come and see them sometime. No bother.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, we will.
Great. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.